Hi, and welcome to History, Mostly Ancient Discussions. Today, we are going to do the 85th in our series on Middle Eastern Islamic history. We're going to talk about Afghanistan and the history of modern Afghanistan. So, the rules for those of you who may not be familiar, this is not an academic presentation. I'm not accredited in history, language, philosophy, religion, or any of the topics that we are going to be discussing today. That said, I want to give a secular presentation, trying not to bias any of the different sides and trying to give you sort of a top-down view. Then this topic, like many other topics, is a topic that will contain sensitive material. So let's be respectful of that sensitivity. That said, I love interactivity. Questions, comments, clarifications, please put those in the chat. I do read the chat and will respond in real time. I like to say that these classes are a 101 and a 201. A 101 meaning that if you don't know anything, I'll catch you up on the basics, and a 201 meaning that if you already know something, I'll probably still tell you something you didn't know. I will have a 2-hour hard stop, meaning that at 9 p.m. Eastern time, wherever I am, whatever slide I'm on, that will be my last slide for the night, and everything else will go into my next week presentation, which is my last in this series. When I put a date below a person, if it's a politician or like a king or a prince or a president, that's their years of service. And if it's a thought leader, like a philosopher, something, a cultural icon, something similar like that, that's the years of their life. This is going to be recorded like the other 84 entries in this series and all of the other series that History Mostly Ancient Discussions produces, which you can see on our website. Our YouTube page is right there. And you can subscribe to that and get up-to-date information on all of the videos that we've put out. You can also join our meetup. Please join our meetup if you want to be part of the Zoom and see these presentations live. You can also ask your questions, and I will respond to them as I do here. And of course, Premium Zoom, Premium Meetup, and Premium YouTube are all costing a premium. And while we're going to continue to perform these for free, if you feel like your life has been enriched and improved by these presentations, please feel free to share that with us. All right. So the first thing that we need to understand about Afghanistan is that Afghanistan is an incredibly diverse country, and that the ethnicities of Afghanistan don't stop at Afghanistan's borders. Right? If we look at this ethnic map of Afghanistan, you can see the Uzbeks are in brown. They continue from Uzbekistan into the country. The Tajiks are in yellow, and they continue into Tajikistan. Kyrgyz are also in that small little wisp on the eastern side. You have the Pashtuns in the south, both, that sort of light pink color, which despite how small it is in terms of territory, is the largest single population. It's also the dark pink as well. You have that light blue, which are the Baloch. You have the Persians in green, in light green. In dark green, you have the Hazara, and you also have Turkmen and in sort of lightish, very light green. So, but let's sort of dig deeper into what are these ethnicities more than just the names. So Afghanistan sits at sort of a crossroads of civilization, right? You have the Middle East and Central Asia. And so because it sits at the juxtaposition of those regions, it has peoples from all those, and South Asia, and has people from all those different regions. It's also sort of why I was hesitant about doing Afghanistan, because I feel like it has a very different valence than Middle Eastern countries do, for exactly this reason. Now, the Tajiks are the same people as the Persians. Tajik is just a dialect of Persian. Of course, what is the difference between a language and a dialect is that you have an army behind it. So Tajikistan exists, therefore Tajik is a language. So is Dari. Depending on the Persian you speak to, some people will say that Tajik, Dari, and Farsi are mutually intelligible. Some people will say that they're not. And so they have a certain set of customs that come from Iranic civilization. These are things like celebrating Nowruz or Iranian New Year. These are things like certain forms of dress. In fact, the dress you see from these Tajiks is similar to what exists in the eastern parts of Iran. And so you can also notice that the northwesternmost part of Afghanistan is almost entirely Farsi speaking, right? It's it's green, so it's the same. They are Persians, so Persian and Tajik is the same in the Afghan context. And the reason for this is that, as we're going to see when we look at a few of the maps, Persia used to control this area of Afghanistan for a long period of time. The dominant ethnicity in Afghanistan, and we're going to see a lot of them and their will, are the Pashtun, and they make up about 42%. So not a majority, but very close. In fact, I can't think of a single Middle Eastern country that doesn't have a majority ethnic group, with the possible exception of Lebanon. But in the case of Afghanistan, that is exactly the case. You have an incredible amount of ethnic diversity. So the Pashtun are a traditionally more tribal people in that they organize themselves according to clans, and those clans have a significant role in daily life. But what does that mean? It means that the elders of the clan are the ones who negotiate disputes between individuals of the clan, or will work with other clans to resolve disputes if it's an inter-clan issue. It means that people will generally live in the same area and won't move to other areas except to major cities because of the clan structure and architecture. It also means that there's a lot of resistance to modernization that occurs, especially when you're in the more rural areas, because the historic way the clan has done, because the leadership of the clan, being old and traditional, generally means that the organization of the people is going to go the same way. Of course, there are going to be counterexamples, and we're going to see a number of those. But this clan identity that is so firmly rooted in both the land and the people on that land is going to be really important for us to understand when it comes to border disputes and other sorts of issues, because the land on which the Pashtuns sit is incredibly important to them because of that clan structure and history. Then you have Turkmens and Uzbeks, who are both Turkic-speaking people. Uzbek and Turkmen are related languages. They're not mutually intelligible, but very close. And you can see their larger state populations in Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. But that's only because of where the Soviet borders were with, so the Russian/Soviet borders were with Afghanistan. There's no meaningful distinction between the Turkmens of Afghanistan and the Turkmens of Turkmenistan, aside from what 100 years has done, or 150 years has done to culture, society, and so on. Both of these populations tended, at least historically, to be a little bit more nomadic, especially the Turkmen. They've become more sedentary as time has moved on. Another group is the Balochi. The Balochi are not very populous in Afghanistan. You can see that they are sort of a small rounding error at the southwest edge. And the Baloch fit more into Indian civilization, if we can call it that, than these other groups do, right? Remember, we're at the crossroads, and so we're going to see different views on different things. Baloch are Muslim, and they have their own language. It is a Persianate language, just like Pashto is, the language of the Pashtuns, and just like Tajik is. And in fact, we've seen the Balochis before, because the southernmost part of Balochistan, the city of Gwadar, which was a port city in Pakistan today, was controlled by Oman. And so when we talked about Oman, we saw the Balochis, who were part of the Omani system. Finally, the last ethnic group is the Hazara, and they exist in the center of Afghanistan. And the Hazara are a people who speak Persian, but unlike the other populations of Afghanistan that are almost uniformly Sunni Muslim, the Hazara are Shiite. And so that creates a sense of friction between them and a number of these other populations. Combine that with the fact that their territory is among the most mountainous and most difficult to control, has meant that that territory has been a seed point of numerous rebellions. And at the same time, they have been subject to significant amounts of persecution because of the faith distinctions. So during the various periods throughout history, there have been contests between the different powers, the powers of South Asia, the powers of the Middle East and the powers of Central Asia in terms of who would control Afghanistan, right? We have Shah Abbas, who we remember from, I want to say, episode 21, and probably a little bit later as well. He expanded his territory, moving east into most of what is today Afghanistan. At the Battle of Kandahar, he was able to defeat the local Pashtun tribes. But later, we saw that those tribes had their revenge. You had the Ghilji, which is one group of Pashtun tribes, led by Mirvais Hotak. And this group was able to organize and, in turn, attack Isfahan, the capital of the Safavid state. Now, there's a question of whether the Hazaras are descended from the Mongol invasion. I don't think it's possible to say that anybody in Afghanistan doesn't have some degree of Mongol ancestry because of how many people in Afghanistan were killed. Afghanistan was significantly depopulated by the Mongol conquest, and we sort of addressed that a little bit in episode 14, if you want to hear more about that. I think what's sort of triggering this view that they might be somewhat more Mongol is that their face tends to look a little bit more Asiatic to our eyes than, for example, the Tajik face. But most Turkic peoples of Central Asia look like this. You can see it a little bit in the Uzbeks, you can see it in some of the Turkmens here. It actually shows more indigeneity than that they were a transferred people. We then saw that Persia under NAD Shah launched another invasion of Afghanistan. The Hotakis were able to win at Isfahan, but then their regime collapsed. Then NAD Shah launched an invasion, and the last Hotak, Shah Hussein Hotak, tried to defend his position in Kandahar, and Nadir Shah was able to overthrow him through the use of his own tribesmen. Now, one of the things that we've talked about within the Persian system is that Persia, at least until the 19th century, had over 40% of its population being nomadic. The Bakhtiyari Lurs were one of these nomadic peoples. And so effectively they used nomad against nomad in order to take down this sort of state. And Nadir Shah himself ended up sowing the seeds for the future leadership of many of the territories that he ended up conquering. Afghanistan is not unique among these, but it is certainly one of them. And so when he led his invasion of Delhi in order to sack the city in an utterly brutal campaign, one of the people who came with him was Ahmad Khan Abdali, who was himself a Pashtun, and a Pashtun who was able to marshal his own forces to establish the Durrani Empire when Nadir Shah was assassinated. So you can see him here being crowned in 1747 as the leader of the Durrani Empire, and at its height in 1761, it controlled almost the entirety of the territories that we consider today as Afghanistan and territories that we don't consider part of Afghanistan today. In the perspective of many Afghans, this is the sort of way Afghanistan should look. And so there's a marked difference between what that is and the country we have today. Notably, a lot of the territories in the south and in the east belong to Pakistan or belong to India today. And some of the territories in the north, in the very far north, belong to the former Soviet states. The British East India Company was able to assert more and more power over the remnants of the Indian states and the Durrani Empire. And the involvement of the British here on the southern flank forced the Durranis to take a new approach in terms of consolidating their power and resisting British imperialism. The way that they most effectively did this was by having states between them and the British. And so if there were states like the Sikh Empire that they had to fight, those were states that at least they had a chance against. And in fact, the Sikh Empire ended up cutting up parts of the Durranis themselves, presaging the British attacks that would eventually come. But the British were also still afraid of Afghan invasions into India. In fact, they were afraid of any invasion from the north into India. And there's a good reason for that. Prior to this point, India had been invaded roughly 15 times from the northwest. India had survived 3 of those times. In the other 12 of those times, that country replaced the northern states of India, or was able to thoroughly sack the northern part of India. And so the British were afraid that that wealth would come against them. And so the British began to try and reach out to other entities. For example, the Treaty of Friendship Alliance in 1809 with the Qajars in Iran, in order so that both of them could try and box the Durrani Empire in. At this same time, the Russians were expanding into Central Asia. So this was Russian imperialism, and the Russians also courted the Persians. As the Durrani Empire became weaker and weaker, and it began to fracture into a number of different quasi-independent clans, right? Because we've talked about how the Pashtun exist as a number of different clan structures. So a number of these different clans broke apart and became their own autonomous regions. You can think of it in the same way that, imagine if the Pope disappeared tomorrow, all the different cardinals would be somehow independent, and still, though, somehow related to each other and related to the same mission. But once these groups became more and more independent of each other, you began to have a number of conflicts between the various different warlords. And the British were able to seize on this, invading Afghanistan for the first time in 1839. The British wanted to handle all of the foreign affairs of that Afghan state. And so there would naturally be a threat from Afghanistan's neighbors that were other than the British in this sort of situation. And so one of these possibilities was a Persian invasion. The Persians wanted to recapture the areas of Western Afghanistan. As we mentioned, those are areas that have been under historic Persian control for quite a number of centuries, and whose majority population was Tajik. As Persia moved further west, the British followed through on their alliance, and they invaded Iran from the south, meaning that the Persians had to stop their invasion of make peace with the British, and thereby restore Afghan sovereignty. So as the Russians move further and further south, the British are more and more concerned that the Russians are going to come into direct contact with British India. So, and in fact, that actually happens in 1885. The Russians cross a bridge into what is Afghanistan, in what's called the Panjshir incident, because it occurred at Panjshir. And the Russian troops that arrived were repulsed by the British, but they were repulsed through a small battle, but mostly negotiations. The Russians and the British agreed that they didn't want to go to war with each other over Central Asia, and so were willing to accept Afghanistan as a buffer state. So you can see that as I pointed out, in 1857, the Qajars gave up their control of Herat in the western part of Afghanistan to the Afghans because of the British invasion in 1857. And now we get to the question of the Durand Line. This is a particularly difficult part of Afghan history, and it's going to drive a lot of the different political machinations that we're going to see. As we mentioned, During the 19th century, a number of the different Pashtun leaders were effectively quasi-independent. One of these was Sultan Muhammad Khan, based in the city of Peshawar in modern-day Pakistan. Others, like we've seen, are Dost Muhammad Khan, who are further west and in what is today Afghanistan. And Sultan Muhammad Khan was in a position where he was afraid of an attack that would either come from the Sikhs, because remember the Sikh Empire existed at this point, the British, or from his fellow Pashtuns. And so as a way of strengthening himself, he agreed to become a vassal of the Sikh Empire under Ranjit Singh. This ultimately did not turn out terribly well for him, in that Singh was able to annex the entire region and bring it as part of the Sikh Empire. And when the Sikhs were defeated by the British in the 1840s, the Sikh Empire was annexed to the British holdings, which put Peshawar under British control. There were additional set of wars between the British and the Afghans to try and control this border region. And one particularly successful British invasion led to the Treaty of Gandamak in 1879. This treaty resulted in the formal cession of significant parts of what is today Western Pakistan from the holdings of these Pashtun leaders to being under the British aegis. It also firmly put Afghanistan as a British client state, with Kabul being forced to receive a British ambassador. Previously, they had rejected that. And in exchange, the British would provide hundreds of thousands of rupees in order to finance Afghanistan and allow it to serve as a bulwark against Russian expansion. And that held for a time, but the border was still not exactly clear. This is a very arid highland region that's difficult to map and control. And so in 1893, the foreign minister of British India, Mortimer Durand, met with the current leader of Afghanistan, Abdul Rahman Khan. Now, Abdul Rahman Khan was able, with this support that the British had provided previously under the Treaty of Gandamak, to unite all of Afghanistan under his control effectively. And he was actually known as a rather tyrannical ruler. He had committed a near complete genocide against the Hazara, as one example. He was known for executing political prisoners and other sorts of enemies. But when it came to the British, he realized that there was absolutely no way that he could contest them militarily. So he entered into negotiations as to exactly where the sphere of influence of Afghanistan would end and where the sphere of influence of the British controlled would begin. And so the line carved on the map that Durand made now bears his name. And Abdur Rahman Khan agreed to the treaty, and upon agreeing to the treaty, he was also given more access to British wealth and British weaponry in order to defend himself, at least in theory, against the Russians. Now, a number of Afghans have painted this, looking back, as some form of treachery, that they literally sold this land of their historical ancestors, the Pashtuns, to the British. But it's difficult to see it this way, given the fact that the British were significantly militarily superior to the Afghans. And while the Afghans could win, and in fact they would win in the during when they fought for their own independence in the 19 teens, the wars in the 19th century had not been terribly favorable to Afghanistan. And cutting their losses in order to maintain some semblance of independence seemed to them to be the better act. Abdur Rahman himself, actually, in the negotiations, told the British how deleterious it would be to cut off formally these Pashtun lands. Because previously, while it was assumed that, for example, Peshawar was under British suzerainty, there had been no formal border erected. There had been no line drawn. And so people moved across that line that theoretically could exist as a natural part of tribal movements, family marriages, and other arrangements. The formalization of this in a border was something that was deeply upsetting to Afghans at the time, and especially to Pashtuns, deeply upsetting today. And so you can see in the context of the great game that the British and the Russians were playing, Afghanistan was an effective buffer state between the expansion of the Russian Empire and the expansion of the British Empire, so that neither would touch exactly. And you can actually see that that small protuberance on the eastern part of Afghanistan is designed to cut across and just create a narrow border between India, British India, and China. Now, as we discussed in the Iranian context, the enmity between the British and the Russians prior to the 20th century was incredibly useful for the Iranians in getting help and protection. They would appeal to the British if the Russians were coming upon them, as was in the case when the Russians conquered the Transcaucasia. Or they would appeal to the Russians when the British were attacking them, such as in 1857. And that led to the creation of the Persian Cossacks. But as we move into the 20th century, France, which was an ally of both the British and the Russians, managed to bring the British and the Russians together, primarily because of British and Russian fears over an ascendant Germany. What did that mean for Afghanistan? That meant that Afghanistan, instead of being between two enemies and being an effective buffer state, Afghanistan was now simply a neutral state between two allies. And that's going to fundamentally change the dynamics within Afghanistan. As World War I happened, and the British and Russians were occupied with what was going on in Europe to a far greater degree than what was going on in Central Asia, Afghanistan was able to begin to mobilize and start fighting for its own independence. And this created a unique situation. In fact, it parallels a situation that we've seen, but not on all fours. And that's the situation of the Grand National Assembly. As we talked about in episode 47 and 48, when we talked about Turkish independence, when Mustafa Kemal launched his army to try and liberate Turkey from the Entente powers in 1918, closer to 1920, he wasn't just opposing the Entente powers. That's Britain, France, Italy, United States. He was also opposing the government of the Ottoman Empire. He declared war on the Ottoman Empire. And so the government that he created, called the Grand National Assembly, was not recognized as an official government by anybody. So he reached out to the only other government that wasn't recognized by anybody either, and that was the Bolsheviks in Moscow. And because of this, Ataturk was able to create a meaningful alliance that allowed him to get weapons and security on his northeastern flank in order to pursue his war of independence, which was eventually successful and resulted in the Republic of Turkey. Afghanistan was in much the same boat. When we see now Afghanistan becomes independent in 1926, the war started by Amanullah Khan in 1919 as the British attentions were fatigued and drawn elsewhere. And in 1926, that full independence came with a recognition by the British that Afghanistan would no longer be a client state. But even before he got full independence, Amanullah Khan wanted to modernize the country. And in fact, he took Ataturk as an example of a way that it could be done in real time. More importantly, it can be said that he was inspired by his wife, Soraya Terzi, and her family. Now, the Terzi family was a Pashtun family from the Barakzai clan. That's the clan that had been ruling Afghanistan. But they were from a section of the Barakzai clan that have been expelled from the country during the 19th century. And during that period, they had lived in the Ottoman Empire. And so a lot of the Tanzimat reforms and the young Ottomans, and then later the Young Turk movement, all of these kinds of ideas that were swirling around in Turkey became incredibly contagious, and the Terzi family was affected. So Soraya and Amanullah Khan discussed at length these discussions about how they could improve the situation in Afghanistan and how they could bring Afghanistan into a more modern century. And there are a number of things that Amanullah Khan did in order to try and accelerate the development. The first thing is that there was large-scale banditry throughout Afghanistan. There wasn't effective policing. Internal infrastructure was relatively weak. In fact, as of today, this is not even a then statement, but as of today, only 35% of Afghans have electricity. And that is in the sense that there are wires that go to their house that supply it, right? This is not a situation of there are rolling brownouts or something. So we really need to take into account just how separated the urban and rural environments are. And when you have that degree of separation, it's much harder for policing to be effective. And this is another reason why the clans are so empowered, because the clans are local authority. They can choose how disputes are resolved, how issues are settled. But now Amanullah Khan was moving against this. By creating these punishments, he's effectively trying to rewrite the agreement of how Afghanistan works, trying to centralize more authority. And naturally, there's going to be some push and pull on that. So in order to continue with his reforms, in 1922, he called a Loya Jirga. Now, a Loya Jirga is a traditional Afghan form of discussion. As we mentioned, tribal elders are the leaders in their region. So how do you get all the regions together to come to a decision? That's a Loya Jirga. So it's more like an impromptu parliament, you can imagine. And he convened over 800 elders from across Afghanistan in order to create a unified authority behind the new constitution that he was going to promulgate. And in fact, he did promulgate a constitution. It had a number of values, whether or not they were implemented, that seem very aspirational. There are things like a limited degree of freedom of speech and a certain degree of freedom of movement. And probably most surprisingly to many people, a significant emancipation of women. Soraya herself was a rather emancipated woman. She did not wear a hijab. In most cases, she tried to cover her legs because legs would also be seen as scandalous. But she and other members of Amanullah Khan's royal family showed what modern women could be. And in fact, they built a few educational institutions that women could attend. They were, Soraya Terzi, I believe, was responsible for building the first women's hospital as well. And you began to have, especially in the cities, a certain degree of liberalization happening in a top-down sort of way. You also begin to have modern universities being constructed and the first Western-style education really coming, especially to Kabul, but also to other major cities like Kandahar or Mazar-i-Sharif. Now, there's a comment here that this sounds like the Wild West. It really was. I think that the Wild West is actually a really great way to imagine Afghanistan, but for one difference. In the Wild West, everybody is autonomous. In Afghanistan, everybody is part of a clan, part of a tribe, part of an established identity. So it's the lawlessness of the Wild Wild West, but the organization of sedentary villages. And so it creates a very strange kind of policing problem because the populations are organized in a way to resist a federal government or a unitary government. Now, Amanullah Khan and all the members of the Barakzai family were Pashtun, ethnic Pashtun. But they spoke Farsi, Dari, Tajik. These are all the same language. Dari is usually the name for the dialect specifically spoken in Afghanistan. And Dari was the official language of letters within Afghanistan. In fact, from Istanbul in the west to Delhi in the east, Persian was the lingua franca of communications throughout the Muslim world up until the 20th century. So it's not surprising that Amanullah Khan's dominant language was Dari. But given the Pashto majority, and given the sense of nationalism he wanted to inculcate within Afghanistan, he decided to lean more heavily into Pashtun and Pashtun identity and Pashto language. It creates a tension between Afghan nationalism as a multi-ethnic, pluricentric idea based on we all follow this king, we all live on this land together, with a Pashtun nationalism, where the Pashtun are the primus inter pares, they are the guiders and the organizers of the state, and the other peoples are more than guests, but less than center. There's a comment here about the caging the bandits. Amanullah Khan had it within his power to execute people, and in fact, he executed large numbers of people. But the specific punishment of caging until death was designed in order to force the person to suffer. And in their suffering, they would scream and shout, and they could receive no help. And that would be a constant warning to everybody that theft would not be tolerated. The prisoners who were caged would not be provided food, water, or any escape from the heat, which would, of course, kill them through dehydration and heat exhaustion. But returning back to the Pashto language, Amanullah Khan made the Pashto language the official language of Afghanistan, and then proceeded to set it as the dominant language of instruction in most schools in the country. Amanullah Khan was also very open, let's say, in his foreign relations, taking the same page out of Ataturk's lens. He sent his own letter to Lenin in Moscow in 1921, requesting that the Soviet Union support Afghanistan and his increasing attempts to gain independence. Remember, he would gain full independence in 1926. So similar to what Ataturk had done by petitioning the Soviet Union before Turkey was a country, Amanullah Khan petitioned for help before Afghanistan was an independent state. And the Soviets sent weapons and money. Most of what they sent was old, used hardware, like the Polikarpov R1, which made up about half of Afghanistan's air force at the time. And this created a fondness between the Afghans and the Soviets that hadn't existed when certainly the Afghans were a British client state. But it was a new future for Afghanistan because Afghanistan could now have allies or alliances. And for the moment, it made more sense to align with the Soviet Union for this possible protection against British India. There's a question, did the king serve as a unifying symbol or force of the nation, and its removal debased the nation as a result? The king absolutely was a unifying symbol. We're going to see either tonight or tomorrow night what the removal of the king looked like. So I don't want to, really shed a lot of light on that at the moment, but the removal of the king was not by the West, it was not by the Soviets, it was by internal politics within Pakistan. So it created a certain degree of instability, certainly, but the majority of the instability came later. Now, as I was mentioning, within the Caucasus region, and we discuss what happened in the Caucasus in much more detail in episode 49, you had what was called the Army of Islam. Now, the Army of Islam was a fundamentalist Muslim recruited military, primarily of Caucasian peoples like Chechens and Circassians. Now, this Army of Islam that operated in the Caucasus was very similar to a lot of what was going to go on in Central Asia as well. So as the Russian Civil War ripped apart the country, you begin to have revolts in the dominantly Muslim countries of Central Asia that had previously been part of the Russian Tsardom and had not yet been fully integrated properly into the Soviet Union. Now, on paper, they were part of the Soviet Union. But that's not how things operated in reality. And so you had a conflagration called the Basmachi Revolt that existed within the Soviet sphere. And it existed out of a hybridization of two different groups of people. The first one were the traditional rulers of Central Asia. And it's worth pointing out that when the Russians expanded into Central Asia, they didn't do so by removing all of the attendant power structures, putting in new Russian leadership, and moving further south. They took the leaders of the various states, the emirs of Bukhara, the emir of Kokand, the emir of Khojand, the emir of Khiva, all these different states, and basically made those emirs part of the Russian system, first through limited taxation, then through routes and tribute, and then effectively annexation in the long run. But these individuals still existed. They still had local power bases, and they still had legitimacy in a way that many of the other individuals that had been Russian appointed or were part of the Russian governing system did not have legitimacy. So you have these old established leaders from the various Turkic states in what is today Uzbekistan, primarily, but also some parts of Kazakhstan, some parts of Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. And so these groups were able to serve as a base and an attraction for the revitalization of Muslim majority states, especially in contrast to the Soviet Union, which was an anti-religious state. The other group were Muslim fundamentalists. These were individuals that felt that Islam was under direct threat from the Soviet Union. And it was under direct threat because the Soviet Union, as an atheist state, was going to remove Islam from the world. And also, as an atheist state, was going to be an immoral state. It was one thing to be ruled over by Christians, as undesirable as that was. And there had been revolts throughout the Russian Tsardom, specifically for that reason. But to be ruled by an atheist state was even worse. These two groups came together as what is called the Basmachi. And the Basmachi started operating probably around 1923, 1924. And that's actually when they became very big. Enver Ismail Pasha, who was one of the engineers of the Armenian genocide and one of the historic leaders of the Committee of Union and Progress Triumvirate, which was the governing entity of the Ottoman Empire during World War I, he fled to Central Asia. He told the Soviets he would work with them in order to put down the Basmachi Revolt. As soon as he arrived, though, he defected and became actually one of the best coordinators and organizers of the Basmachi Revolt. And he was shot there, ironically, by an Armenian soldier in the Russian army. But the death of Enver Pasha was not the end of the revolt. And in fact, the Basmachi also influenced people in Afghanistan. Amanullah Khan, because he had reached out to the Soviet Union for help, was seen as somebody who was pro-Soviet to a certain degree. And also, he was somebody who embraced a number of the progressive traditions that the Soviets embraced. For example, the clothing emancipation of the clothing and educational emancipation of women, the moving away from a number of other traditional values, such as constitutionalism. All these ideas were things that within the fundamentalist camp, and there are more traditional camps within the Afghan population, would be unacceptable. So when Amanullah Khan took a trip in 1928 throughout Europe, a very lavish and expensive trip. He went to Britain, he went to France, he went to Germany, he went to Moscow, he went to all these different places, spent a lot of money. In fact, the British, there are questions about whether or not this story is true or apocryphal, but there's a story that the British took a picture and doctored it of Soraya Terzi showing her legs, so that way these groups, these fundamentalist groups, would be even more inflamed than they already would be. And they led a revolt within Afghanistan, throwing Amanullah Khan out of the country. In fact, Amanullah Khan never successfully returned to Afghanistan, although he did try. In his place arose Habibullah Kalakani, who you can see in the picture. He's the one slightly to the left. And he met with Ibrahim Bey, who was the leader of the Basmachis. In fact, the Basmachis realized quite early on that the Soviet Union could effectively control most of the territory that was in the Soviet Union, and so they would be hunted from place to place wherever they went. But if they crossed the border into Afghanistan, they might be able to get a reprieve. And so he pulled his forces into Afghanistan, where you can see them there. The Russians followed them first in 1929, and then again in 1930, the first time unsuccessfully, the second time successfully, trying to oust the Basmachi from Afghanistan, and with the tacit approval of the new king of Afghanistan, NAD Sha. So Kalakani was only in power for about 10 months. And in that time, NAD Sha was able to move in from the south, conquer Kabul, and then give authority for the Soviet Union to invade and remove the Basmachi from Afghan territory. NAD Sha was assassinated in 1933 at a high school graduation. And so Muhammad Zahir Shah, or Muhammad Zahir Shah, came to power in his stead. In fact, Zahir Shah would be the longest reigning single monarch in independent Afghan history. So that's the last 200 years or so, independent, quasi-independent. But of his reign, most of the time, he allowed his prime ministers to do the primary act of governance. So some of the achievements that we're going to talk about as being his are probably more the work of his prime ministers, but he does get the accolade for actually following through on them. The first thing is that in the later 1930s, he began to reach out to the other Middle Eastern states. And so we can see that there's an orientation within Afghanistan, both from the fact that Soraya Terzi was bringing in Ottoman traditions to Afghanistan, and the fact that Zahir Shah is putting his attention towards Persia and Turkey, that there is a desire for Afghanistan to look in a Middle Eastern direction rather than a South Asian or a Central Asian direction. The Central Asian direction, of course, would be either closer to the Soviet Union itself or closer to the Muslim majority states within the Soviet Union, all of whom were not progressive and therefore not aligned with the values of the Barakzai family. And so he helped facilitate the growing relationship between Turkey and Iran, and in fact, seizing on the opportunity where the Prime Minister of Iraq was a Turkmen, was able to bring Iraq into this alliance as well, which was called the Sa'adabad Pact. The pact was basically a dead letter. It didn't really do much, and didn't prevent Iran from being invaded, for example, in 1940 by the British and the Soviets. But it shows that Afghanistan wanted to be an active part in the relationships of the region, and at a fundamental level, wanted to integrate those values. The Ottoman Empire and its constituent and its descendants were all much more progressive than were the territories of Afghanistan. And so rather than look to the West specifically for inspiration, they needed to look no further than other Muslim countries that had done the same thing. But there are also other entities that became more and more prominent within Afghanistan. Abdul Majid Zabuli was an Afghan financier, and he actually created the Afghanistan Bank. This bank was responsible for funding a number of business ventures within Afghanistan, the very beginnings of proprietorship and a more modern economy. And Zabuli was also working together with a number of foreign agents. Zahir Shah permitted numerous individuals from various countries around the world to come to Afghanistan. In fact, Afghanistan was able to get worldwide recognition through the League of Nations that facilitated many countries, including the United States, recognizing Afghanistan in the 1920s and 1930s, and then beginning to assist Afghanistan with its own growth and development. One of the countries that was particularly helpful was Germany. Germany, especially during the early Nazi period, began integrating Afghanistan into its Organisation Tod. And Organisation Tod was a German expertise and industrial development organization. They sent a number of technical advisors to Afghanistan in order to help build the country. Similar to what we discussed with Turkey and Turkey's fascination and Iran's fascination with Nazi Germany, Germany was a country that was projecting foreign influence in the region in a way that previous German empires really hadn't. The German Empire certainly had done a number of things in the westernmost parts of Turkey, but the idea of a German presence in the eastern part of Turkey, in Persia, in Afghanistan, this was a much further pressure than Germany had ever provided before. And Germany was a power that served at the exact opposite polarity of the British and the Soviets, which meant that they could be a new way of getting more independence by balancing the Germans against these other major powers. But when Operation Countenance happened and the British and the Soviets both divided and conquered Iran in World War II, Afghanistan was in a difficult position. Zabuli was directed by the Americans, the British, and the Soviets to force all Axis advisors, those are German, Japanese, and Italian advisors, to leave the country. And not wanting such an invasion, they complied. Now, Afghanistan, like North Yemen, is one of the few countries that was completely neutral throughout World War II, despite its pro-Axis sympathies, because of its position between British India in the south, occupied Iran in the west, the Soviet Union to the north, and Kuomintang, China in the east, surrounded literally by allied powers. They stayed neutral. Despite the fact that Afghanistan was neutral, that didn't mean that it came out of the war unscathed, as the British diverted significant amounts of food that would normally cross the Pakistani border into Afghanistan to feed its own troops. There was a mass famine within Afghanistan. The Soviet Union similarly was not allowing food and other important things to cross its border into Afghanistan. And so the country suffered immensely throughout the war, despite it not actually having fought in any of it. When World War II was over, the Soviet Union still occupied parts of Iran and tried to turn those into vassal states. As we mentioned in episode, I want to say 76, this ended up not working out. Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi was able to launch a successful invasion and reincorporate these territories back into Iran. But there was always a lingering fear now in Afghanistan that the Soviet Union might turn it into that. Now, relations with the Soviet Union were still rather good, and so it wasn't an immediate fear, but it was something that Afghans would think about periodically. And this put Afghanistan in a very awkward position as the Cold War was beginning, because a number of organizations had been developed by the West in order to constrain the influence of the Soviet Union, like the Baghdad Pact of 1955. What's notable is that Afghanistan did not become a member of the Baghdad Pact, despite it being right on the border of the Soviet Union, like a number of these other countries, Turkey, Iran, were. Afghanistan wanted to maintain a position of complete neutrality, working with both the West and the Soviet Union because of its strategic location. So Mohammad Zahir Shah was actually one of the few people who was able to cultivate relationships with both the United States and with the Soviet Union. And in fact, both countries provided tangible aid to Afghanistan, which was unique, or rather put Afghanistan in a very unique tier, but as very few other countries have managed to achieve that. And so Zahir Shah wanted to use that money to improve the country and its development. So he began to invest in infrastructure development. He began to look after the creation of new highways, new electrification. He increased the number of formal universities. He increased the number of schools for both boys and for girls. He was responsible for the proliferation of other healthcare measures. But at each stage, Afghanistan wasn't developing based on its own internal revenue generation, but from the aid money that had been procured from the Americans and the Soviets, which meant that the economy was constantly trying to absorb these benefits. The other major piece is that because of the importance of the cities to the educational apparatus and the creation of the intelligentsia that would be running this state, significantly more emphasis was placed on developing the cities than on improving the rural environment. And this caused the progressive view of Zahir Shah to be less uniform throughout the country. The Americans, in terms of their relationship with Zahir Shah, were consistently worried about the relationship between Afghanistan and Pakistan. Now, Zahir Shah, more than Amanullah Khan, began to lean into the Pashtunistan idea that both sides of the Durand Line, where Pashtuns live, be it in Afghanistan or in Pakistan, should be united under Afghan power and authority. Of course, Pakistan, which had inherited that territory when it became independent in 1947, was thoroughly opposed to the idea that it would cede territory to another sovereign state and wished the Durand Line to continue as its formal border with Afghanistan. And this began to inflame relations between Pakistan and Afghanistan. More importantly for Afghanistan in the long term, this would also inflame relations with the United States, because the United States had chosen during the Cold War to support Pakistan as an ally against socialist non-aligned India and the Soviet Union and communist China's expansion into South Asia. So there was consistent pressure from the Americans to solve the situation with Pakistan and to avoid the Pashtunistan issue. Ironically, a lot of the intellectuals within Afghanistan, especially if they were Pashtun, were in favor of discussing the Pashtunistan question. But they did it almost cynically, and this is why. A discussion on Pashtunistan would ultimately be a question of what would be the benefit for those Pashtuns to be under Afghan authority rather than to be under Pakistani authority. And those benefits or those rights, shouldn't they be for all Pashtun anyway? Just be something that's given to the Pashtun of Pakistan in order to entice them to want to be part of Afghanistan. And so the question of Pashtun rights and Pashtun unification became a backdoor way for them to talk about freedom and other human rights, especially in the late 1940s. In 1949, Zahir Shah convened a Loya Jirga, and they came to a consensus of creating a certain form of democracy, and or limited democracy, perhaps we can say. And part of that was the creation of freedom of speech, which lasted from 1950 until 1953, when the freedom of speech was abolished because too many people were saying things that were, to the king's ear, not pleasant. And furthermore, his cousin, Muhammad Dawood Khan, became his prime minister. And Dawood Khan was thoroughly opposed to the idea of multiple political parties, multiple different perspectives. He was going to be the leader that brought the country with him as a one-party state. And if this sounds familiar, it probably should. It's in the same model of Ataturk. Although Ataturk at least tried to pretend that he believed in multiple parties, but he kept sabotaging them. So Muhammad Dawood Khan continued these kinds of progressive developments. For example, he solicited the funds and organized the creation of the Helmand Dam, which sits on the Helmand River that straddles both Afghanistan and Iran, in order to create hydroelectric power. But Muhammad Dawood Khan was a very strong supporter of the Pashtunistan idea. And he was so supportive of it, in fact, and made so many comments about how Pakistan's border isn't real and that the Pashtuns should all be united, that Pakistan literally just closed the border on them, which meant that all their imports had to come from the Soviet Union, and that's not the most effective way to bring them in. Faced with the possibility of starvation, Zahir Shah demoted Muhammad Dawood Khan and took power in his own right to try and create a new multi-party parliament called the Walesi Jirga. And we'll talk more about that next week. So, questions, comments, concerns, please put those in the chat while we're waiting for those. This is History Mostly Ancient Discussions. I am Richard. Today is a Wednesday, and we will finish this tomorrow. This week. Sorry, we'll finish it next week, September 6th. And that will be the final episode in this Middle Eastern series. And we will cover the multi-party monarchy of Zahir Shah, where we'll talk about the Republic of Afghanistan under Muhammad Daoud Khan. We'll talk about the Sour Revolution and the Soviet invasion and the Soviet war. We're going to talk about the aftermath of the Soviet war, including the creation of the Islamist governments that existed throughout the 90s and the consolidation of the Taliban. And then finally, the US invasion of 20 years and its result, a new Taliban government, which seems to have returned us back to the year 2000. You can also see our short run series, like the Ukraine war, whenever we get back to that. And there are also older series. And of course, I encourage you to see the other episodes in this Middle Eastern history series if you like what you saw today. So questions, comments, concerns. There's a rumor going around that this series will start from the beginning with episode 1 in the near future. No, I'm sorry to put that rumor to rest, Robert, but if you want to see the series, it's all up on YouTube, all 84 other episodes. And I think that you can enjoy it. And if you have any questions on something you've seen in those series, please feel more than free to ask in the comment section. Among the Central Asian countries we've looked at, would you say that the tribalism remaining entrenched in Afghanistan was more stubbornly rooted than others? We actually haven't looked at any other Central Asian countries. We've looked at Middle Eastern countries. And that's sort of why I hesitated to bring Afghanistan into this. For one, I don't speak any of the languages. So my Persian is okay at best. So it's a very different mindset. Now, if we were to look at the Uzbeks, Tajiks, Turkmens, Kyrgyz of the 19th century, I'm leaving out the Kazakh because Kazakh tribes are very different. If we were to look at them, we would see that they were roughly as tribal as most of the groups in Afghanistan. The Pashtuns are particularly tribal when we compare them to even the groups within Afghanistan, and certainly more tribal than the other groups in the Middle East, with the possible exception of the tribes that exist in Saudi Arabia, which we saw a bit how those are structured as well. But the reason why those 18th century similarities among Turkmen, Uzbek, Tajik, and Kyrgyz don't survive is because the Soviet Union stamped it out. The Soviet Union actively deracinated the Turkic peoples of Central Asia. Now, some of that they're beginning to recollect in the post-Soviet period, right? That's why you're seeing increased religiosity. That's why you're seeing traditions that had largely died out during the Soviet period, like bride kidnapping, begin to make a resurgence, these aspects of traditionalism. But the connection to the elders has effectively been severed. And that just never happened in Afghanistan. And we're going to see that the attempts to create that are going to engender a much stronger response than anything that the Afghans could put down. So I think that Afghanistan could have moderated in the long term and become something more like Jordan, where tribal politics is certainly a part of Jordan, but it's not the defining aspect of the country. But that's obviously not what happened. And we're going to go through why that was. I think it's a great question. The ethnic composition of Switzerland borrows from nation states surrounding it like Afghanistan, but the ethnic affiliations or tribalism seem to tear Afghanistan apart, whereas it seemed to drive Switzerland together. I would argue that Switzerland, my expertise is not in European history. So if somebody wants to contradict me on this, I'm more than open to that. But my understanding of how the cantons joined together in Switzerland was a 300-year process. I think Geneva was the last canton to join in 1915. So take that with a grain of salt. the fact that the Swiss are united is a long-standing conversation. And the Swiss also had numerous religious persecutions because a number of the cantons were Protestant and a number of the cantons were Catholic during the Protestant Reformation. So there was certainly a lot of push and pull there. But at a fundamental level, the Swiss started as a military alliance and then became a country of equals. All the different cantons had their own weight within the larger Confederati Helvetica, right? In the larger Switzerland as an entity. And they remain a confederation to this day. You also don't have tribal politics, you have regional politics, which is more typical of Europe. Europe tends not to be, at least when you're west of the former Berlin Wall, not to be as ethnically concerned as east, because there's been a lot of homogenization through culture and development. So there are several different points that show up here. First is that Switzerland is a confederation, that it came together incredibly slowly, that it came together through union against military threat, and the organizational apparatus of most of the cantons grew in much the same way through the European Enlightenment together. In Afghanistan, none of those are true. The country was held together by a dynasty that didn't have a lot of effect on the ground because of feudalism. It came together very quickly over the course of, Amanullah Khan was the first person who really tried to federalize it. And to Zahir Shah, we've gotten about 50 years. So very short time frame. It's constantly at war with itself and its own different constituent parts. And there's a huge distinction where you have clan structures that really interfere with unification efforts. I hope that sort of teases out the distinction. If somebody has an opinion, disagrees, wants to add, more than happy to see that in the comments.
So, Richard, I have a question. So, what's interesting, I apologize, I jumped in front of the line. Sorry about that. First of all, I want to thank you for, and I want to offer people for next Wednesday, maybe raise a glass for Richard, like you have champagne, water, it doesn't have to be alcoholic. We kind of celebrate Richard's, ending this series, and it was, a year and a half, almost 2 year, and we really
appreciate. No, it's 2 years. I started in July of 2021.
July of 2021. Wow, 2 years and 2 months.
And Shane, yeah.
So it's. We'll obviously have Richard back for European Union with collaboration with Aaron. I hope.
Yeah, no. This will not be my last. The next presentation will not be my last presentation ever. It's just this series is going to end.
Right.
Yeah,
we are working on the Pacific series, which I need to get Jason, Pang to hopefully do the Taiwan, independence of Taiwan and the history of China, and Alex. And then Richard lived in Korea for 3 years?
I lived in Korea for 2 months, but
2 months.
But I have a number of presentations that I can give on Korea. I have stuff from Vietnam. So no, if you get Asia up and running, there are a few presentations I can give there. There's definitely a space for me here at History Mostly Ancient. So it's just yeah.
We'll just do raise a glass to the end of the series. How about end of the epic series? But I have a question. Is this interesting? I served actually six months in famed Uzbek army on the border with Afghanistan, Termez.
Sure, Termez, yeah.
And one thing I've heard over and over, a 18-year-old boy, serving on a border, is, Zach, no matter what you do, these people has been fighting for thousands of years. They're they have fighting blood, fighting in their blood. So basically, what I'm trying to say, when is the peace ever gonna come to Afghanistan? And then why were they successful in being in peace before Soviet invasion? And I will get to that obviously next week. But why is everybody has a notion that these people are just born for fighting, and there's really nothing else they can do. There's going to be a tribal divide no matter what. Uzbeks and Tajiks and Pashtuns would never, collide, and I mean, never collaborate together. What can you say about that type of stuff? I mean, it's just a notion, and correct notion.
I think the idea of saying that some people are warlike and some people are peace-like is kind of silly. People are drawn by culture, and people are drawn by grievance, and people are drawn by money, and people are drawn by a lot of different factors. And one of the things that I've tried to demonstrate throughout this series is that, and I hope people have sort of taken this away, a lot of what happens in these countries are individual decisions by individual people who are motivated by whatever motivation strikes them, right? You have somebody like Amanullah Khan, who, he married a woman, and her idea of modernity, like he also talked with her father. Her father is also a very famous philosopher. Really inspired him to be a modern person, and that's how he wanted to rule Afghanistan. And so, had he married somebody else, had he not been convinced by these ideas about, the Ottoman Enlightenment, he could have been the same like Abdul Rahman Khan in 1880, who was a strict authoritarian, despotic ruler, and we would never have had this progressive shift within Afghan history. So, for me, history is not determinative; it's contingent, extremely contingent. And so the situation that existed in Afghanistan from, let's say, 1930, when NAD Sha came back to power, to 1973, when Mohammed Dawood Khan caused his coup, that was a period of 43 years where the internal functioning of Afghanistan worked. You had what was effectively different trials of, how much democracy are we going to have? How much parliamentary system are we going to have? Or how much direct authority do we have? And people tried different things. But there wasn't a war going on. And in fact, that period from 1930 till 1973 was a period where pretty much every other country on the planet fought a war, at least one, if not multiple. So the idea that the Afghans are just some kind of warlord people, and that's just how they're going to end up, I think is extremely reductionist. That said, the structures that exist in Afghanistan, especially among regional peoples, be they Hazara, be they Pashto, be they Tajik, all these people who live outside of the major cities, those are difficult structures to modernize. And it's difficult to get these people to buy into the process of modernization. So unless they can be bought in, either Afghanistan stays where it is as a dirt poor country where half the people live below the poverty line, or this friction is resolved by getting them to buy in somehow. And as we're going to discuss, there were two different communist parties in Afghanistan. There was the Parchami and the Khalki before the Soviet invasion. There were democratic coalitions that existed, didn't have a lot of success, but existed during the American occupation. It's entirely possible for Afghanistan to move in that direction. It needs the right set of people, the right set of circumstances, and also the legitimacy of being Afghan and making that argument as an Afghan, like Amanullah Khan did or Zahir Shah did. If the Soviets try to make that argument because the Soviets were extremely progressive, or the Americans try to make that argument because the Americans are somewhat less progressive than the Soviets, ironically, it's not going to hold the same way as if an Afghan does it. And so that's what they need. if they want to move forward in that direction. If they want to stay more traditional, that's also a direction. And there'll be something like Yemen before the Civil War, sort of isolated, traditional, what have you. All right, there's a question here. Is the Hazara tribe considered less educated than the others? This is what it appears in the novel, A Thousand Suns. Yeah, I think the easiest way to understand the education divide in Afghanistan is rural versus city. And the Hazara are overwhelmingly rural. So the Hazara being less educated is a result of the condition of rurality, not a condition of being Hazara. There's no repudiation among Hazara for education. And I would say actually that the clan structures among Pashto are stronger than those among Hazara. So if a Hazara person wanted to seek education in the cities, it would be easier for them to do so. The other fundamental issue we need to keep in mind is that the Hazara are subject to consistent and persistent discrimination in the context of Afghanistan. During the American occupation, it was somewhat less, but except for that period, and to a certain degree, the Soviet occupation period, Hazara have been accepted at universities in lower numbers, have been accepted at schools in lower numbers, have been accepted at jobs at lower numbers, proportional to their population, because of that negativity. So that's certainly a situation. Patty, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, and initially, relative to the question comparing Switzerland, it occurred to me that this area, the whole thing that comprises Afghanistan, seems like a much more rugged sort of country, and the modernization that what's his name undertook, he did concentrate only in the cities, which seemed to exacerbate that kind of pocket tribalism as well, rather than giving it a new way of reforming itself. And so I think that would be the biggest difference. In Switzerland, there would have been greater incentive and much less difficulty in uniting in according to common interests than seems to have occurred in Afghanistan. Is that sort of on the money?
I think the beginning of that really started to hit it. I would say that Switzerland is a bunch of cantons, right? So it's city states, and so the cities are all important within their own canton. So in Neuchâtel, it's Neuchâtel. In Geneva, it's Geneva. In St. Gallen, it's God, I forget the major city of St. Gallen. But in Zurich, it's Zurich. All these different city states that are part of Switzerland, they're highly urbanized, number one. So that's the exact opposite rural to urban population ratios we have in Afghanistan. But each city is concentrating on itself, and each city is modernizing on its own, right? Switzerland is a confederation. It's not a federal union. It's not like the United States. Think of it more like the European Union. I think that's a better model to sort of understand Switzerland, but just imagine that on a smaller scale. The national government of Switzerland doesn't do that much in terms of organizing education, organizing funding, organizing industry. That is done on a canton by canton level. So the investment in the cities makes sense, but it's investment all from the local cantonal governments. In Afghanistan, you have a leadership that has to pick and choose. Where's it going to spend its money? Well, Zahir Shah wanted to concentrate on the cities primarily because that's where the intelligentsia who would be guiding the policy were from. And therefore, he could benefit them. And therefore, they could continue to expand in number, fill out a bureaucracy, begin to create more infrastructure, and develop it out. And maybe if he had more time, it would have worked. Donna? I hope that sort of addresses your point.
I think so. You're not disagreeing, in other words, that the choices and the circumstances that befell Afghanistan tended to emphasize and push the tribalism back into itself, as opposed to finding a way to bring people out of those pockets, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
So, Richard, final presentation on Afghanistan will be next week at 7. Then on the September 16th, if you guys are interested in a powerful women's series that we're running concurrently with Richard's group, we're going to do Queen Elizabeth of England. So, that's related to Edward II, right? We will find out, did she have a child with him? What was her life like, and stuff like that. Then we also have Asian philosophy with Jason Pang, and he's going to discuss on September 23rd Taoist philosophy king. So then on the 24th of September, we're actually doing Templars. As we know, Templars is the one that protected the pilgrims that would basically, it's a knighthood order that would go into Jerusalem. We'll talk about Templar and their knighthood order. Then we actually doing on September 30th, maybe commemorative to what Rich is doing, but more ancient. We're gonna have Beverly and me talk about the Iranian history, and particularly we're gonna talk about Medes and the early Archimedes. And I think we touched on this a little earlier in beginning of presentations, but we're mostly gonna focus on Medes and just really early Archimedes and stuff like that. Then we have a bunch of philosophies, and we actually, if you guys are in New York and you want to check out, and we're gonna have an in-person meet first time in a while. We're gonna watch a movie and then discuss it. The movie is called Prince of Foxes. We're talking about Venetians about 15th century. Really interesting movie. And then and that's will be October 28th. We're doing a bunch of other stuff. But in November will be an interesting one. We're going to talk about Judaism, which is called November 28th, Nature of Judaism. There's a bunch of other presentation in between. I just wanted to point the interesting one. And obviously it's going to be serious at some point of update on the Ukrainian war situation. I think right now counter offensives going on. Prigozhin had passed away. I think we're due for one, Richard. No, don't you think? At some point.
That's a conversation to be had with Aaron. If he wants to schedule it, then I will be there, and we'll make it happen.
Yeah, and at some point we still have to. Somebody owes me. We're gonna talk about the Louisiana purchase, and
yeah.
we still working on that, and then also we'll do. We're gonna talk about Irma Grease, who was the hyena of Auschwitz. That will be in October as well. Still working out the kinks. I moved it actually from end of the month. She was torturing all the prisoners in Auschwitz, and committing all kind of inappropriate acts with them, and she was executed by British forces at the age of 22, the youngest person to be executed for her misdeeds, so to speak, toward the prisoners. All right. That's all I want to say. Richard, sorry.
Yeah, no, one of the things that I've been thinking about and I've been sort of playing around with it is if in 2024 I wanted to give 2 or 3 presentations on a few specific indigenous American tribes, because I think that especially the Haudenosaunee, they're commonly called the Iroquois, but they call themselves the people of the Longhouse, the Haudenosaunee. I think that their story is particularly interesting because it sort of turns on our head the idea of what colonization is, and their interaction with the Americans. Same with the Cherokee. That's not to say that they weren't abused through the colonization process. They absolutely were. But I think that the story is a lot more nuanced than white people came, we all die. So that's something that I would love to do in 2024. I'm still trying to work out the kinks of how I'll have time for it and everything, but that's something that I've been playing with, in addition to helping with Jason's Asian series and the occasional Ukraine or European Union series with Aaron. There's a question here, comment. we should have a MENA history marathon and stream every single episode nonstop. So it would be over a week. I have to say, if you want to, there's a playlist. I'll send you the link. You can, you could knock yourself out. Sometimes when I need to have like a computer keep running, like just, and not go into screensaver mode, I will set up that playlist and put it 1.5 times speed or 2.5 times speed, because I speak a little slowly for my own ears.
Richard, what about trivia? What do you think about a trivia? Like, I'll set something up like that, and then we'll have fun. We'll tell people to on Zoom get drinks and enjoy themselves, sit down, and then
I'm worried that it'll happen like last time we tried to do trivia, and I asked people questions, and like nobody wants to answer because nobody.
Well, and then later on, there was a lot of people that were answering. I remember Howard, Ralph was participating.
Yeah.
Too, and
no. I was gonna say, like, in the beginning when there were far fewer of us, I think more people participated.
Right.
But
you
then,
used
like,
to do quizzes, right? You used to have.
I used to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I used to do those. And then I realized that like people weren't answering, and like I was like, okay,
Look,
because it takes me a while to put together those quizzes. Like I have to make all the wrong answers. And the wrong answers have to sound convincing, right? I can't just say like which of these is not a country in Asia. Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Switzerland.
Right.
In our defense, Richard, the language barrier is huge. It's very, very difficult for me. No matter how long I'm looking at those names up there, it's very difficult for me to integrate the sound of the name with the look of the name, if that makes any sense to you.
And to me, that's the irony, because I tried to write everything in the same standard way as often as I could. But there are a lot of sounds that just don't exist in English. And so there's like, how do you represent the sound of or how do you represent the sound or ha, or like these sounds just don't exist in English.
Yeah, it's not a criticism.
Hard.
It's just, that's what I'm saying. I don't have experience in those languages other than, Russian, but, the Asian ones, I don't have any real experience. So it's very hard for me to integrate that into the existing body of knowledge I've accumulated over my life.
What about something like episode 64 talks about Iran, and then episode 36 talks about this? So kind of the trivia, which episode talks about I could make it general like that. And then within that, you could just say Crusades. Let's say we just talk about topic Crusades. People win, I don't know, $50 Amazon card or something like that. People would participate somewhat. I would donate, and then people get in, and then in the end we'll put the pot, and obviously we'll take Richard out for a nice dinner, and then and whoever else can have a dinner with Richard, and he's an interesting person, and you get to go out with Richard, type stuff, and then we'll join me and and Robert will join, I'm sure, it will be one of the prizes.
I mean, more than happy to either take a real dinner or a virtual dinner for those of you who are slightly further away from New York than perhaps you would like.
Right. Exactly. New York is a hub, so anybody coming to visit us always can, look us up, and we will have a lot of the in person. And actually, I'm going to start a travel club. Finally, I got a travel person in Uzbekistan and a couple other former Soviet countries, Georgia and Kazakhstan, that I'm talking to. And there's a lot of people that's starting the travel club. So I'm going to start getting a group together. Probably not this year, but when it's going to get a little warmer, there's going to be more of a, Uzbekistan is a very, Richard been there, is very pretty and have a lot of historical value. So is Georgia.
And the fruit is really amazing.
Food is amazing, and then we'll make it very interesting. We'll go to outskirts and like suburbs, see how people live in. I mean, it's nothing like you're not gonna go to like Afghanistan or anything like that. I mean, it's safe, stuff like that. So Even if there is going to be interest to go to Afghanistan, who knows? People probably.
I think Afghanistan has to have a few governmental changes before tourism really starts up. Like I might be calm and discerning about different political influences, but no, I like Taliban, I mean, I've read a number of different people who are both pro-Taliban and anti-Taliban, and I have not found a single person who says that they know what the fuck they're doing. Like even the pro-Taliban sources are like, yeah, we just took this guy who'd been serving in the front lines, fighting the Americans for 3 years, and we just gave him the Ministry of Interior. What does he know about interior other than he's seen it with his eyes? Like
maybe it was interior designer. Maybe it was interior designer. You know
this is something that a lot of people don't understand about how government takeover is supposed to. And we talked about this a little bit with de-Baathification in Iraq. If you take over a government, you have a serious problem because a modern society does not function without bureaucrats. It just doesn't. It's the economy goes to crap, and the major services, sewers, electricity, gas, sanitation, all this goes out the window immediately. If you don't have the bureaucrats who actually know how to run this, policing, fire, everything. And then you just sort of devolve into these little city-states, which is pretty much how Afghanistan already was. So you're not losing that much on the organizational spectrum. You're losing a lot on the human rights spectrum, but you're not losing that much on the organizational spectrum. But if you want to have a chance at a modern state, you need the bureaucrats. And say what you will about the the government that existed under the American occupation, the Northern Alliance government, and there are going to be lots of criticisms. I'm going to give them to you when we do that presentation. But they had people who were relatively experienced, and where they did not have experience, they had advisors to give them the experience. The Taliban has none of this. So it's like, imagine you took, a couple teenagers off the street and you said, okay, guys, allocate the power grid. It's just a non sequitur of this does not work, and just the level of it not working is amazing to behold and scary to realize.
One of my favorite photos post-withdrawal from Afghanistan is of the various Taliban members dressed like, very traditionally, but with all kinds of weaponry. And they had taken over a hotel or resort or something that had those paddle boats. And so there was a whole flotilla of them paddling these boats with all this weaponry, dressed in their Taliban outfits. It's just I just think it's the epitome of what Afghanistan has become. Yeah. And again, my mental comparison was, just like George Washington crossing the Delaware. It's just a very hysterical picture.
No,
I can imagine.
One thing I understand why they hate women so much. I just don't get.
Okay.
It's crazy.
Okay. I meant to address this. I'm trying to find the nicest way to say this. The perception that somebody who is in Taliban has about men and women is not the perception that you and I have as regards men and women. The way that in the West we perceive men and women is that they are biologically different but mentally the same. And therefore we should give them the same rights, access, and privileges that we give men. And that was a hard fight that women fought in the West for about 150 years, give or take. And in some parts of the West, they seem to be losing part of that. So
yes.
So let's let's not be so haughty about how far we've come. But their perspective is there is a specific role in society for men, and men have certain obligations and duties and functions. And there are certain roles for women. They have those obligations, duties, and functions. And the obligation for the man is to provide a wage for the family. That is his job. It is not something like in progressive circles in the West, there's a discussion about should the woman be the breadwinner? Should the man be the breadwinner? Can they both be relatively equally earning? And so in the West, we have that conversation. In the Taliban world, that's not a conversation. That's just silliness. Men were designed by God with this purpose, and they have to do it. It doesn't matter if they work 3 jobs. Men have to provide for their woman. That's it. And how are they going to provide? Well, the way that they're going to provide is by getting an education and doing a job that earns them the money. Or if they can't get an education or don't want to get an education, working the fields. And the woman's job is to stay in the house, keep the house clean, and provide children for the next generation. That is the woman's job. Woman does not need education for that. In fact, the more seats you give to women, the fewer seats there are for men. It's a zero-sum game of who gets to sit in the seat.
Is there also that element, though, that if you introduce women to anything beyond house and children, they're going to become dangerously unhappy?
Not that they'll become dangerously unhappy, but that they'll be dangerous in the sense that they will be violating the natural order of things.
Okay.
It's the
Dangerously confused.
Yes, exactly. Dangerously confused.
All right. So what is for women to do if she has no man and she has 5 kids, and it's a war-torn country? So her man went and died, exploded on one of the mines. So
find another man
with 5 kids is going to be very difficult. It's one of the things that,
Oh, I agree. I don't think that their worldview is parsimonious.
Right.
But that is their worldview.
Because it almost reminds me of, obviously it's during the communism, they tried to free women and stuff like that. And, the people were wearing burqas in Central Asians and they were throwing them out. But this interesting is after the World War II, a lot of the Russian soldiers died, and women were by themselves with kids and stuff like that. And they were given those jobs that normally men would hold, like factories, even during the World War II. That's not the, obviously that's not the notional that it would ever be. There's 22 million people in Afghanistan, right? And, half of it is women. That's a large workforce. So
it is a large potential workforce. Afghanistan doesn't have the problem of a low population relative to how many have died. I mean, it's an unfortunate and sad statistic, but Afghanistan has a very high fertility rate. There are a lot of people who are, for want of a better term, outside of the standard economy. There's more than enough positions for the men to fulfill exclusively. Not that they should, but they could. So I don't think the Taliban are going to come undone from the simple economic argument of you have X number of men, you have 1.3x jobs, therefore, unless you employ women, you're not going to get fulfillment in the same way that you did in the Soviet Union. So I don't think that's not going to be what's going to move the needle for them. I think what would move the needle for the Taliban would be the Taliban having to share power with some other coalition. I don't know what coalition that would be. It doesn't seem like there's a very strong rebellion at all outside of the Hazara majority regions, maybe Panjshir Valley. But like the Taliban seems to be putting that down relatively well, especially considering that Americans and the Soviets had massive difficulties in the Panjshir Valley. So I don't have a lot of optimism for the state of women in Afghanistan in the near future. There's a comment, even in the West, families disappearing gradually. All of Afghanistan's problems is because of Western imperialism. I think it's a little overly simplistic to say that it's Western imperialism. There's a certain degree to which it's also Soviet imperialism. I think there's also a certain degree to which it is Afghan traditions butting up against modernity. I think it has a certain degree to do with the involvement of the ISI and in Pakistan. And while that was supported by the Americans, a lot of their motivations have been at odds with American motivations. So they're clearly an actor of their own at this point. I think there's a certain degree to which we can say that individual will, such as how Daoud Khan launched a coup. He launched that coup without support or solicitation from any of the Western powers or any of the Eastern powers, and not from the Soviet Union either. So I think that it's very simplistic to say that Afghanistan's problems are only Western imperialism. I think Western imperialism is certainly a part. I don't think that it's the whole story, and I think that it's reductionist to say that it's the whole story.
Well, it's interesting the comment just made. Obviously, you're gonna touch on Amin next week. I mean, that's another topic.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, it's just, I hope people are, will join us from today, and it's a very heartfelt topic, and his affiliation, his political views, which we're interested. Yeah.
There's a comment here. Western imperialism has destroyed the Soviets. Were not there long. They were there for 10 years.
10 years, right? Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't think that that's not long. And also the people that they installed, like Karnal and Najibullah, were there until 96. So that brings it from 79 to 96. I struggle with how that's not that much than the Americans who were there from 2001 to 2021. So if your view of imperialism is they took it over, then that's it. But the Soviet Union has certainly had influence, and the Russians before them have certainly had influence in Afghanistan for the last 200 years. So I think that that's something that we have to consider, and along with Western imperialism, along with internal factors and all those things. And then Western imperialism destroyed women's rights too. I'm not quite sure how that works. There are a lot of rights that people in theory would have that the West has been less than great in protecting. I'm thinking of drone strikes, for example. I'm thinking of the Bachi. I'm thinking of the opium fields. There are a lot of crimes against humanity of varying degrees of severity that the United States committed while involved in Afghanistan. I don't know any of them that specifically targeted women or set up women for a position where they would be targeted. Maybe I'm missing something, but the Taliban's position on women, if anything, has gotten more liberal since they've come back to power. That's they moved from negative 85 to negative 84 on a scale of 0 to 100. So
Maybe.
like this is not a great advance, but
right.
Yeah, I just don't see it.
Not to cause any rift here, but maybe she meant the Western values gave women rights and therefore destroyed a family because women now know their worth. I don't know. Maybe that's what she meant.
I mean, that could very well be the argument that because women are now working outside of the home, that it's destroying the traditional clan structure, right? Because if a woman has wealth, she can advocate for herself. That could be, but I wouldn't say that that's destroying women's rights. I would say that it's ending women's place, if you're coming from that conservative perspective. Anyway, I think that's a lot of stuff that we've talked about. If there are any last questions, let's put those in. Otherwise, thank you all for the really nice comments. I think Robert was joking when he says that he should get a degree or something. That's very flattering. So anyway, thank you everybody for coming, and I'll see you all next week.
Thanks, Richard. Good night, everybody.